New York City is often referred to as a sanctuary city. Is it? And if so, what does that mean?
You know, there's no legal definition of a sanctuary city, but a sanctuary city is, to my mind, is a city that doesn't allow a single government resource to be spent unless it's absolutely required by law to further the deportation machine. It's a city that goes above and beyond to protect the safety and security of all of us, including our immigrant friends and neighbors and family. And so that means that the police can't give information to ICE unless they are legally required by a court order. And that means that Rikers can't say, hey, John Jones is being released today, and he's
come and get him, right? Exactly, right.
Come and get him,
right?
And that's such an important protection because if local government is in cahoots with ICE, that means that anybody who is remotely vulnerable and every person who has an immigration status and might be perceived to have an immigration status, right, either is or feels vulnerable under this administration. And that means people won't be able to protect their families, take their kids to school, go shopping, go to court, report a crime, be a witness in a case where we absolutely need them. So
what happens now if an immigrant who maybe has a case before the immigration judges gets detained by ICE? What happens to them?
Well, there's a whole cadre of people that goes to 26 Federal Plaza to accompany people so that whether or not they can prevent somebody from getting detained, and sometimes they can record it and make sure that people are notified and that they have access to the means to file a habeas petition. A habeas petition is what you file. It's the old, great, hundreds of years old writ inherited from the British.
Right.
The produce the body. It's the writ of last resort to challenge unlawful detention. And there's a whole bevy of lawyers that are set up to file those, to help people file them. And some people go to court with blank forms to fill out so that they can file them themselves.
There have been a lot of people detained here.
Yeah.
Under the Trump, thousands, I gather. Are there a lot of, I know there was a story the other day about this opposition to a detention center they're trying to build in
Chester, New York.
Right. Mm-hmm. And also one in New Hampshire. There's a big outcry.
And Kansas.
And Kansas. Well, I assume the detention population, immigrant detention population, has increased. Are there a lot of immigrant detention centers around the state, in the city?
In New York, there aren't.
There are not.
There are not. There's Batavia, and 26 Federal Plaza is not designated as a detention center, but that's where people
Right.
are detained
Right.
And then shipped out. But what we're seeing all across the country is that the Trump administration's effort to convert unused warehouses into detention facilities, prisons, concentration camps, all over the country is meeting resistance. This is the good form of NIMBY. Nobody wants a detention center. Nobody wants a concentration camp in their backyard.
Now,
And places like Texas and New Hampshire, communities, whether they voted for Trump or not, are coming out to stop it. And these efforts are being rolled back, which is a really good thing.
Because a lot of these detention centers, I gather, it's becoming an industry. I mean, a lot of them are privately run, and they're run for profit, which means that the people inside don't get much food, medical care, because there's a profit motive involved.
There's a combination of cruelty, sadism, and profit motive. And you know, in Dilley, the conditions are horrific. The NYCLU, my organization, filed a lawsuit about the conditions at 26 Federal Plaza. There are regs in place, you know, indicating how, prescribing what kind of facilities you have to have if you're going to hold somebody in detention, and they violated all of them. I mean, they're crowding hundreds of people in cells that were supposed to be limited for a dozen people or so, not providing access to food, medication, lawyers, and we won a preliminary injunction in that case. Of course, the implementation, you know, we have to keep going back to court and try to get them held in contempt or get them ordered to comply, and we're doing that. But I left out a couple of detention facilities, and I want to go back to that because a couple of communities, some communities around New York State, have signed agreements with ICE to use their county jails as ICE detention facilities. Nassau has a horrific detention facility. There's one other that I can't think of right now. But what we're proposing on a statewide level is to make New York a state that is safe for immigrants. And that means no state or local facilities could be used as ICE detention facilimes.
That will require a state law action by the legislature.
And none of these like 287G agreements, that's a term of a reference to the section of the law, but whereby local police agree to work for ICE. Nassau County has one. There are 13 others around the state. That's devastating, because if you can't trust the local cops to take care of your kid when they get lost, or to help you when you've been the victim of a crime, or to even ask directions, right?
Is there legislation proposed now?
Yes.
In the state there?
Yes.
Okay.
It's called New York for All. And New York would prohibit 287G agreements. It would prohibit informal arrangements where, you know, local cops call up ICE and say, you know, just thought you might want to know about the guy we're releasing today. None of that can happen. It would prohibit them allowing ICE to rally in the state police parking lot without a warrant.
It took us 4 years to get that law passed in 2019. But what's been happening is that the governor has failed to adopt a financing system in order to implement the law. And she's now done this twice. There was congestion pricing, if you remember, a year ago, was supposed to start in early July. The governor got spooked, delayed it. It wasn't until our organization and others sued her that the governor finally came around and realized that congestion pricing was the law of the state and they needed to implement it. And she did it again at the beginning of 2025. We were supposed to have something called a cap, trade, invest system, where we were supposed to target polluters and use the revenues from those targeted polluters to help build out the infrastructure that we need to reduce carbon emissions, as well as put money in people's pockets. All we hear about is the need for affordability and how gas prices and everything are out of reach for people. Well, here was a system that would literally put billions of dollars into New Yorkers' pockets, and the governor, again, apparently is spooked by potential Republican attacks and has decided to delay this program as well.
Yeah.
So our work is only as good as the implementation of the chief executives.
How do you feel about congestion pricing? Because people have wide-ranging views on it.
Yeah, I will tell you, we were among the earliest supporters. Like, this was something that we, along with a lot of transit and environmental justice activists, started pressing the Bloomberg administration back in 2007. And if most people don't remember, but the first attempt to get congestion pricing passed was actually in 2009 under the Bloomberg administration. And when he was unsuccessful, we literally spent the next 10 years advocating, because there was no other way of raising the revenues we needed to make our transit and bus system anywhere near a 21st century system, right? So yeah, we spent a good 10 years fighting, and ultimately, then Governor Cuomo and the legislature came to realize there was no other revenue source they could count on. And here we are a year later, and it's a raving success. I mean, I don't,
Is it, and how is it doing in terms of reducing, has it actually reduced car traffic in the city?
It's stunning. Yeah, not only is it reduced, like literally within the first month, something like 7%, there was like a 7% drop in traffic, which doesn't sound like a lot until you start putting numbers to it, right?
Yeah.
But congestion pricing, there have been a number of recent reports that show not only did emissions go down in the congested zone, it went down citywide. It went down for the Bronx also, which is exactly the reason the EJ activists supported congestion pricing, because these trucks and cars that are coming from the suburbs are driving through our neighborhoods to get to Midtown. And so, and not only...
And some of them are huge, you know,
absolutely.
huge trucks in local neighborhoods.
And for us, it was one of those systems where you're not only reducing air emissions, but the monies collected are going to go to build out mass transit, which, you know, you have to give people options. If you're telling them you shouldn't drive, or you're charging them to drive, then they need, you know, the incentive, and they need the access to the services in order to take buses and trains. And now that money, about $500 million, is being targeted for just some of these programs. So it's a raving success, yeah.
We touched on open space issues, you know, how much greenery and space do people have to live their lives in?
Yeah.
How do you make more open space available to people when it seems like they're building on every empty lot in the city?
It is. It's a range of public priorities that successive mayors have had a mixed bag of success in terms of how do we. So, for example, if you look at extreme heat, most people don't know right now over 500 New Yorkers, right now in New York City, die every year from extreme heat exposure.
Is that true?
Over 500. But these are stats from the Department of City Health and Mental Hygiene. So
Because I remember some years ago, one summer in Chicago, 600 people died from the heat. And I said, how can that possibly be? But you're saying New York
over 500 every year. Now, and the thing is, like, you know, it's, some of it is our older folks with compromised health immunity. There are a range of contributing underlying factors. But again, over 500 people a year die with these complicating factors coupled with heat exposure, right? And what's really worrisome is if you look at projections from the New York City Panel on Climate Change, by the 2050s, they expect the number of 90-degree days to double, the number of heat waves to triple or quadruple. The average summer day is going to be like 4 degrees hotter. So when you start adding all this stuff up, and you're already seeing 500 New Yorkers dying every year, their own estimates show that there's an expected 70% increase in morbidity just from heat, right? And when you look at all the different climate change exposures that people have, when you add them all up, storm surge, just other ways that people die from climate change, heat is the #1 killer of all. When you add up all climate change impacts, heat dwarfs them all. And we are now looking at a city known for urban heat island effect. We're looking at a city where, again, the disparities between which communities are physically hotter than others. For example, public housing, NYCHA residents live in 10 of the 12 hottest areas of New York City. If you look at green and open space, people of color and communities of color have 33% less total green infrastructure and park space than non-communities of color. So when you look at the kinds of systems that we need in order to reduce the urban heat island effect, to give people more of a chance at not dying early in the 2050s, then you need a range of interventions, including wildly expanding the city's amount of green infrastructure. So one of the things that we're working with is a citywide coalition that just passed a law that mandates that the city of New York has to identify a strategy to increase our green space to about 33% citywide. So it's a significant, I think, expenditure of different revenues and resources and programs that we need. But whether it's cooling centers, whether it's green infrastructure, there's a range of things the city needs to do to get New Yorkers ready for climate change, and that's just heat. Yeah.
The public housing projects, are they allowed to have air conditioning in the public?
Yeah. In fact,
Because I remember there was a time when they weren't.
Yeah, no, they have. I think that part of the problem, for example, like when COVID hit, there was a commitment by the then de Blasio administration to set aside something like 60,000 air conditioners, because we were afraid up until that moment that if you did not have air conditioning and you wanted to escape kind of like the worst of the heat, in the summer days, you'd go to a cooling center. And one of the things that we found out is these cooling centers are disproportionately cited. They're not, the communities like Canarsie and Elmhurst are communities that are some of the hottest in the city, have no cooling centers, these two neighborhoods, and there are a few other ones like that. Some of these cooling centers, in fact, don't know that they are cooling centers.
Joe, you have done a lot of research on the right wing, and I'm happy to have you here because I can ask you, the MAGA movement, to what extent is it driven by race?
It's driven extraordinarily by race, but not only. But you remember when Trump announces his candidacy for president in 2015, he immediately opens up with a racist screed against, particularly against Mexicans. But there is, his own political history goes back to the Central Park Five, who were 5 young black men who were finally exonerated for a rape of a white woman, who he made it his life's work to get them behind bars. More recently, when he...
And he paid an ad in the Times to,
yes,
that
a full-page ad in the
the
Times.
death penalty.
Yes, that's exactly
convicted.
right. During the Obama administration, Trump pushed this idea of birtherism. He became kind of a star of the Tea Party movement at the time because he pushed the racist idea, that conspiracy that Obama didn't have, wasn't born in the U.S., didn't have a birth certificate. This was kind of mixing together anti-black racism, anti-immigrant racism, and Islamophobia all together in one conspiracy. And that kind of catapulted him into national politics. And so that, at its kind of its origin story, founding moment of MAGA really is a deeply racist one. And it was partly in 2016 based on anti-black white grievance, racist anti-immigrant sentiment, racist Islamophobia. So all that was really in the mix there, and it has only kind of metastasized since then. So race is certainly a major component of the movement.
Who do you feel, or what do you feel, have been the most effective forces in pushing back against this erosion of the civil rights movement? Is it the judges? Is it people in the streets?
I think it's been a combination of the people in the streets and the lower court judges, but especially the lower court federal judges. They have really been holding the line for this democracy.
At times, it seemed like they were the only ones.
Yes,
holding
and
the line.
many times. I mean, the fact that you had these major law firms capitulate so early on meant that the people scrambling, trying to bring these lawsuits to be before the court, because the court could see very serious issues, but they can't alone just make a statement about it. So they had to wait for the cases to be filed. So you have the lawyers who are willing and able to be a part of these lawsuits, the federal court judges. Almost every day you see those lower court judges bringing opinions before us that are common sense, anti-corruption type opinions, and the people in the street. Unfortunately, the protests that we have, whether or not they're No Kings protests or other protests, American opposition protests, they're not telling the people what they should do. That's the missing element. And my other book I have is A Protest History of the United States, and it's over a 500-year arc, and once again looks at the need for protests to disrupt. Protests have, and disruption doesn't mean violence, but disruption has to be something that says you cannot be comfortable in your oppression. And right now, the authoritarian figures are very comfortable in their oppression. It's only the lower court. And then this idea that, well, we'll just wait for the U.S. Supreme Court because they're in our pocket.
Yeah.
And so many people believe that, whether or not, you know, it's more than the two who were personally vetted by Donald Trump. But it's seen as though the six supermajority of conservatives following in political ideology is what's happening right now.
What might that disruption consist of? What might that be?
Well, most disruptions, if we look at George Floyd, if we look at the anti-war movement and the feminist movement and other movements, it's individual people putting a monkey wrench, you could say, in the economic systems. This is what happens during the civil rights movement. You had the sit-ins. The sit-ins actually disrupted the businesses. You have to do something. This is a capitalist country. You're going to have to do something that disrupts the business as usual. And those protests we've had so far haven't done that. They've shown the disdain for the authoritarianism and frustration, but they have not taken that next step, which is necessary in this country. That might work in Europe, but it doesn't work here. In this country, those protests need to go further. The voting rights protests in you know, Martyrs Day US is something I've been working on because there are voting rights martyrs. People have lost their lives trying to vote in this country in the 1960s and beyond. I'm not saying that it doesn't come with some level of harm, but I think from a standpoint of the millions of people on the street, that power needs to be used more effectively in disrupting business as usual, corporations and others, so that they pay attention to our undermining of the democracy that's taking place right now.
I would say there's one exception to that, which is the resistance to ICE in Minnesota we saw last winter, which was extraordinary in a couple of ways. One, people did throw a wrench into the works by producing a crisis on the streets. ICE was unable to function without being tailed, without being followed, without being disrupted, without being harassed over and over in the streets, which started with hundreds of activists, then thousands, then tens of thousands, and then finally across the state, hundreds of thousands of people were involved. More so than Democratic Party leaders were comfortable with, either the mayor of Minnesota or the governor of Minnesota or the attorney general even. People kept pushing the line and pushing what they were willing to do and making extraordinary, well, finally, the ultimate sacrifices in a few cases.
In the lives lost.
Yes, and lives lost. And so that was part of what made it so difficult, because I think people around the country saw, people are actually standing up and actually disrupting this and making this stop. But the other point about this being a capitalist country, the economic blackout that happened in January in Minneapolis, organizers got unions out, unions organized, businesses organized, everyday citizens organized to shut down businesses and shut down shopping across the state and to target the major corporations that are based in Minnesota, like Target, for instance. It was that moment when they called for an economic blackout and it was clear that hundreds of thousands of people were going to participate in this. That's when suddenly J.D. Vance comes to Minnesota. That's when, this is a moment when they are nervous. They're like, oh no, we have to stop this. And it's soon after that, finally, that Greg Bovino, the literal Nazi who was running, now he just was at a white supremacist conference in Europe last week, throwing Hitler open palm salutes. He was removed in that moment, and it's still, ICE operations still go on in Minnesota the way they go on here and everywhere else. But it was a moment where it was that disruption, and it was courageous disruption, and it wasn't just symbolic marches in the street. It was actual direct action, people putting their bodies on the line that really did change the calculus and it began to change what ICE can do. I mean, we're seeing similar things happening right now. In New Jersey. Yes, and the Delaney facility where there's a hunger strike going on.
And even the Target boycott that's taking place. They've had to remove the CEO of Target,
What's that about? I'm not familiar with that.
Because yes, there's been an ongoing boycott of Target, selective purchasing. People of color not going to buy at Target because Target decided it was going to roll back any type of diversity, equity, inclusion. And diversity, equity, inclusion, I'm hoping lawyers are listening, that they will finally start bringing lawsuits that show that diversity, equity, inclusion actions by this authoritarian regime are also anti-Black, and that's the purpose of them, to undermine Black progress. But the one thing that very quickly we have not talked about and no one talks about is the reason why this is happening right now. And it's because of 2045. In the year 2045, this nation is going to be majority people of color. I knew this 15 years ago. Other people know this who are part of this regime, and they want to put forward an apartheid type state in which they maintain control no matter what the population is. So we need to understand what the battle is about when it comes to voting rights, the power of the Black vote, the power of people of color to vote, of women, of their rise up economically, socially, politically. All of that is at the crosshairs of what we're witnessing. We have to understand what the full sense of it is, and the vote is at the core of it.
Right. Joe, we got about a minute left. You can have the last word.
I just want to say, I think that this last point is a very important one, and it's important partly because it's a way that the right has been able to enlist white liberals as well. There's a, one of the only differences between this and the end of Reconstruction is that we've seen this chipping away happen of anti-discrimination law and policy and affirmative action happening from really the 70s onward. And it's because a lot of white people are really uncomfortable with this fact and with the idea of Black equality and brown equality. And so when this anti-woke stuff happens on the right, they don't oppose it the way they should be opposing it. They don't come out, and this is what kind of allows these things to happen, is when people don't see that the alarm is sounding and that their own democratic rights are going to be hurt by this too. It should, in a self-interested way, they should be thinking about this. But partly that's what it is. This is a deeply white supremacist country. It was founded in Black slavery and settler colonialism, and those things go beyond just the right or the MAGA movement. They're things that we have to confront generally in a way that the right is now hoping that they can erase from history altogether.
Yes. You said 2025. I think the
2045.
2045. Yes, because I remember, and when that report came out, it was front page article on every newspaper. It was news on every TV show, and I remember writing a column about it. Why is this such big news? And I think it was for exactly the same reasons you were saying. So, unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank Gloria Browne-Marshall, Professor of Constitutional Law at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and author of The Voting Rights War, and Joseph Lowndes, Professor of Political Science at Hunter College and Director of the Public Policy Program at Hunter's Roosevelt Heights. Thank you for joining me today. To learn more about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Instagram at 1-to-1 CUNY TV, and you can watch the show on the go by downloading the CUNY TV app. For 1-to-1 and CUNY TV, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.